Great to be tonight with you on our third session of Great Texts of Judaism. I feel that we're already getting into the role, and it feels wonderful. Tonight we are on the next and last portion of the biblical books, Ketuvim. And the lecture will be given by Anshe Emet's own Rabbi Dror Shenkin Gold. Rabbi Dror Shenkin Gold was ordained by the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in 2013. A native of Southern California, he received his BA in sociology from Pitzer College in Claremont, California. Subsequently, he went on to serve for 2 years as the Senior Jewish Campus Service Corps Fellow at Columbia/Bernard Hillel, focusing on outreach and inclusion. During the time, he published an article in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament documenting a feminist recovery of Bathsheba. He also served as editor-in-chief of the Hillel LGBTQ Resource Guide, distributed to university campuses around the country. Upon entering the Ziegler School, he was selected a Waxman Graduate Fellow. During his tenure at, I have the wrong page. Sorry. To be continued. All right, cliffhanger. During his tenure at Ziegler, Rabbi Shenkin Gould served as a classroom teacher, retreat director, and curriculum author for Los Angeles Hebrew High. He also served as an education fellow at the Brandeis Collegiate Institute and as the student rabbi at Temple Bet Am. Before coming to Anshe Emet, he served as a chaplain at UCLA Medical Center. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dror.
Well, fun to hear your own bio. I don't hear that all the time. It's like, oh yeah, I did some of those things. Before we begin tonight with our learning, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the day on the calendar. Today is the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And so as we begin to learn together, frankly, the closeness of that memory is more resonant for us perhaps than it would have been even a couple weeks ago, when we know what it is to have those folks who would enter our places of worship and attempt to destroy them and to stop us from doing what we're doing. We know that that's not a story of the past, it's also a story of our present. And so tonight, as we learn, I'd like to offer our learning in dedication to the communities who survived and did not survive Kristallnacht, but us who hold their memory dear, and I think we do honor to them by continuing to learn the very texts that they no doubt learned. In a sacred space that I imagine they too would love. And what Yiftach didn't know about me in my bio is that I love Tanakh. In rabbinic school, we get to choose a major. So I did a lot of work in Tanakh in particular over the course of 5 years, which means that you get to do things like pick 100 chapters of Tanakh that I'm going to particularly master, and then need to be able to cite, translate them, and explain them over the course of a 5-hour exam. So that happens to be a little bit of my background, which means I'm teaching you stuff I'm really excited about. And tonight, we're continuing with the third chapter of learning about the Tanakh and learning about the Hebrew Bible by looking at Ketuvim, which is writings, which is really the other category in the Tanakh. You learned about the Torah, you learned about the Nevi'im, the prophets. Ketuvim is everything that's left over, but it's got a lot of the really juicy stuff. So what I want to do is first orient us to what that is in the Tanakh, then go through the particular interesting histories of the books in Ketuvim, and hopefully do some learning together. So, how does this work? Perfect. Okay. So just as a reminder, you no doubt know, but we're looking back at the corpus of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, and all of the portions that are part of that, right? You've already looked at the Torah, which is what we would read on Shabbat. right, with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And last week you looked at the prophets, that's the N in Tanakh, right, which are each of the individuals that we have a record of their speeches, of the ways that they heard from God and reported back to us about their messages. The last set of the Tanakh, the Chara in Tanakh, is Ketuvim. And you can see here it includes a very eclectic array of writings, from Psalms, Proverbs, Job, into the Megillot, and then into some of these books at the end. So we're going to tackle them one by one, but that's the orientation to where we are. There are 11 books in the section of Ketuvim, and truthfully, they're in 3 different sections. There are 3 different subsections of what's happening here that are completely different genres of literature, in addition to different histories. The first section, and we'll come back to this, we sometimes call wisdom literature. It's literature that seems to talk less about adherence to temple ritual or sacrifice, and more about the idea of what is it to be a wise, good, moral person in the world. Some people include Psalms in this category, some people don't, right? But it certainly always includes Proverbs and Job, and most would also include, truthfully, one of the Megillot, Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, is kind of doing the same thing. It's giving the sort of generic wisdom, not per se rooted in Jewish ritual, which makes it really, really different than other books in the Tanakh. It's a genre into itself.
Does that mean that since it's not rooted in Jewish, could be applied to other?
These are very universalist texts, so you're not wrong about that. They're texts that lots of people pick up on. So Kohelet is quoted by the Beatles, right? And Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Hardy are quoting from these texts for a reason, and that's because they're speaking in what we might think of as very universalist terms. And of course, they're still Jewish books. They're in the Tanakh itself, right? They have a Jewish orientation, but they're less ritualistic than certainly Leviticus or even other books of histories that are focused on the temple, Jerusalem, those kinds of themes, less so. Psalms does have those themes, but if you look at Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, you're really not going to find those particularist themes at all. Right, so that's a great question. So they are very universal texts. The second part of the Tanakh, and we'll come back book by book, are the Megillot, right? So you may know we have 5 Megillot, and Megillah is just a scroll. This is the only part of the Tanakh that's organized not by chronology, but by calendar. It's organized in sequence of when we read them in our liturgical calendar. So you're moving here where each of the Megillot is associated with a different Jewish holiday, starting with Song of Songs at Pesach, Ruth at Shavuot, Lamentations or Eicha is Tisha B'Av, Ecclesiastes, Kohelet is Sukkot, and Esther is Purim. So these are aligned by the holiday by which we read them. They have nothing to do with one another. They are not in chronological order at all. But what they are is in the order that we read them in the calendar. So effectively, the rabbis elevated these texts to the point that they knew that we would hear them every year. Unlike, let's say, Ezra, that you would never hear unless you studied the Tanakh. The final part of the Tanakh that we'll come back to are the histories. These are Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So it's a really, again, a completely different genre of what we're talking about. Daniel, we'll get to, was going to be one of our palace stories of being in a palace in exile. And Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles are taken to be the final books of composition. They're very late, as opposed to other texts in the Tanakh. They're telling a history after the exile when the Jews returned to the land. So that's very, very late as compared to other texts. So that's a little bit of an overview before we dig in. Before we dig in, does anybody have any questions? Where are?
When you say it's in the Tanakh.
Yes.
And I'm in kindergarten.
No, you're good. So where in the
Where would I find these?
where would you find these? Good.
I didn't know I'm going to go for it.
Good. No, it's an excellent question. So you're not going to find these in the Chumash, right? So that's the thing, right? So if you come on Shabbat, right, and you're looking through the Torah portion and the associated Haftarot, the Haftarot are all drawn from Nevi'im, from prophets. So that means in the Chumash you won't find one bit of this. Not one bit. You're only going to find this if you pick up actually the full Tanakh, the full Hebrew Bible off of your bookshelf, right? So most of this stuff you're not going to find as we move through the Torah portion. What we'll see is some of it we find in our liturgy, like Psalms is most of the Siddur, right? A majority of the Siddur is either direct full quotes of chapters of Psalms or parts of Psalms. The Megillot we do read on the different holidays, and these books you would never ever hear if you were in shul every day that you wanted to be in shul, you would never hear them. So they just really live on a shelf in the book of the Tanakh, right? Which, thank you, Liz, right? A Tanakh, a Hebrew Bible that moves from the beginning to end, right? So unless you were in a study place, you wouldn't find these books, right? So that's very different than Torah or than Nevi'im, which are incorporated into our calendar so that you're always going to be exposed to them. You could miss this stuff unless you took it off the shelf.
What's the Hebrew for Chronicles?
Divrei Hayamim. Right, so all of the books have different names, right, in the English than in the Hebrew. The Hebrew names are either reflecting the author or the first words of the book, something like that, and we have different Greek words that seep into our practice. But yeah.
What are the Beatles quote?
There's a time for everything.
It's a bird. It's a bird.
Sorry. Oh, man. Now you can't trust me anymore. Sorry. Citations, it's terrible. My pop culture is not doing well for me tonight. Other questions? Oh, okay, so let's move forward. Good. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at this genre of wisdom literature, right? Which is the stuff, again, this is some of the good stuff that you're not going to find unless you dig in. The first piece of wisdom literature, I want to say here in general, wisdom literature is characterized by the observation of nature and understanding, oh, what else did I put here? Can I move that? Well, I'm going to say it. Nature and wisdom as the source of understanding and the use of reason to determine the best course of human happiness. So to Deborah? To Deborah's question earlier, you can hear that again. That sounds pretty universal, right? You're hearing less about Torah and laws and more about an orienting to the natural world and to wisdom. Job is set up like that. So Job starts with a prologue, which you may have heard. It's a famous story about a man who is effectively tortured by God, though we know him from the narrative to be a good man. And we find out that he's being tested to see if he holds on to his faith. What does that mean? Job is a direct theological repudiation of Deuteronomy. It's saying precisely the opposite. If you read in the Torah in Deuteronomy, you would think that God rewards good people and punishes bad people. Job says that's not true. Life is more complicated. So after you move past this prologue, this story about God testing Job, not because he's bad, but because he's good, we hear speeches from 3 different friends of Job. That's the bulk of the book is these lectury speeches, and they're not really good friends. These guys spend their time saying, hey dude, it must be that if you are being punished by God, you did something wrong and you're just not reflective enough about your sins. Why don't you think harder? Which really is the worst thing you could do in terms of taking care of a friend, right? You must have done something to bring this upon yourself. So they go on like this, the 3 friends, for the bulk of the book, until we actually hear from God. And God has 2 long poems that come in, where God answers Job out of a tempest, out of a storm. And God actually says to Job, you did nothing wrong. It's just that the way I work is beyond your capacity to understand. And there's a bigger picture than you. So Job is actually presenting a very different take on theodicy, on how we understand there to be evil in the world and a God in the world, than Deuteronomy. It's quite opposite. And it's a direct choice to put that out there. It's a really interesting book in that way, very complex. If we move to Proverbs for a minute, we'll come back to Psalms. Proverbs.
What's this question?
Yes, sir.
Where is Uz?
Where is Uz?
Job is set in Uz?
Yes, the city that of Uz.
Yeah. In
Uz. I don't know the answer.
Iraq.
We can.
Iraq.
What's that?
In Iraq.
Iraq. It could be, but I'm not going to swear by the answer. I'm happy to make sure that I look it up and get back to you. But I don't know the answer to that offhand about what modern day country it's in. But let's hold that question and come back to it. Proverbs, written around between 961 and 922, set in the ancient Mediterranean. Proverbs, the rabbis believed that Proverbs were written by King Solomon, and we'll actually see that the rabbis believed there were 3 books that Solomon wrote. They believed that Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs, that he wrote Song of Songs, and that he also wrote Ecclesiastes. So all 3 of those are attributed to King Shlomo. Scholars believe none of the above is actually the case. But you should know that Jews for centuries have believed that Melech Shlomo wrote all 3 of these books. The belief is actually that he wrote them at different points in his life story. That when he was young, he wrote the Song of Songs, which is a series of love poems. That when he was in his middle age, he wrote Proverbs, and when he was towards the end of his life, he wrote Ecclesiastes, he wrote Kohelet. That's what the rabbis believe to be true. We can take that for what it's worth, right? What Proverbs are is they are a series of small, pithy statements that tell us what it is to live a good life. It's advice. It reads like a book of advice, often actually directed from a parent to a child. One of the interesting things that you see in the book of Proverbs that you won't see anywhere else is the character of wisdom. We're talking about wisdom literature. Actually, wisdom is personified as a female, chokhmah. Right? It's really similar to what you might see in Greek literature of Sophia as the idea of wisdom. You have this chokhmah, this woman who represents wisdom, and she sort of circulates throughout the book of Proverbs. And the more famous pieces you might have heard from Proverbs are the phrase Eitz Chaim Hi, right, that we say when we take the Torah out. That comes from Proverbs, right? It's a tree of life. And also Eshet Chayil, the blessing that sometimes husbands will give to wives before Shabbat, that talks about a woman of valor and the characteristics of that. That's also part of Proverbs, right? Because it's talking about what makes for a good person, right? That's the general character of the book. Psalms, on the other hand, which can be grouped into here but is really separate, are really 150 poems that were used for liturgical purposes. They were sung. They were performed in the temple by the Levites. According to our tradition, the Psalms were written by King David. Most scholars believe they were probably written by a lot of different poets over time, but we do believe that they were actually used in the temple. Most of them are set in Israel, and you'll find them throughout our liturgy. Again, the majority of the Siddur is really quoting from some of these different psalms. Another use that you might see for them, and where you see psalms actually manifest, is that people today will use psalms when they're praying for healing. So often, especially in the Orthodox community, especially amongst women in the Orthodox community, you'll see a practice of when someone is sick, that somebody will take out psalms and read them through and move through the book one by one and hoping for healing. So there's sort of a spiritual quality that's long been associated with them as a series of sacred prayers that people have said over time.
There's a big time period difference in time between Job and the others.
Good, totally
So
different.
what would have been the reason why?
What would have been the reason that Job would have been written?
Political situation that why was the need 1,000 years later, 900 years later, saying, hey, don't.
It's a beautiful question because you are looking at a relatively late text, right? So that's accurate, and you're looking at something that's really saying life doesn't always work out in a positive fashion. So correct. So it could be right that you're situating yourself right certainly in an era where Jews have at this point lived through massive destruction, right? And so perhaps it's a response to that. It's written in a very personal fashion, not in a very political fashion, as opposed to some of the other books, which have very strong political overtones. When we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, they're very clearly political books. I wouldn't say that it jumps out that Job is doing that, as opposed to responding to more of a theological or philosophical shift. But it could be. Steve?
Why do you believe it's done in the 6th century?
Why do we believe that Job is done in the 6th century? It's to do with the language primarily. So the language can be dated. It's one of the ways, the greatest tools that Bible scholars have to be able to figure it out. And the language in Job, which is very, very, very hard to get through, gives a lot of clues that it's a very late text. Also, it's quoting from ideas that we see in other kinds of literature around that time and in other societies that seem to be echoing these major ideas. So those are two tools to be able to date it. Yeah, Don.
I'm just curious with Psalms, because as you mentioned, we're familiar with the liturgy, but it's never start to finish. But yet, for example, Kabbalah and Shabbat, we have a series of Psalms which for the most part are contiguous. I know they throw in that Psalm 29. And then at the transition, Sukkot to Zimra, Shabbat, we do the later ones, because I know we have Psalm 150, Hallelujah. So I was just curious how the rabbis decided to take a few groups and kind of keep them intact, but yet everything else seems to be scattered from
Yeah, there is actually some sense that at some point there was a practice of reading through the entire book, and that it probably became pretty unwieldy. I can't imagine the reaction of the congregation if we tried doing that today, right? You're shaking your heads like, don't even think about it, right? But there is a sense that happened. The piece that's interesting that you're pointing to is some of them really have a big life in the life of our liturgical calendar. For example, different psalms are associated with different days of the week, and they actually say that in the inscription above them, say like this is a psalm for Monday. So we have some clues about some pieces of it. The psalm for Shabbat mentions Shabbat, right? So there's a reason why that's said on Shabbat. There are other pieces that just got picked up over time, and people have their best guesses about why the one for Monday got put on Monday or where that is. What's interesting though is you mentioned Psuke de Zimra, that's in the morning, right? That's the prayers that we say at the very beginning of the morning service during the day or on Shabbat. And there's a series of psalms. And as Don said, the practice is to read the last group, right? So we end with Psalm 150, that's the Hallelujah song, right? And 145 is Ashrei, right? So you probably, those ones between 145 and 150 will be the most familiar. That's because there was an idea that you were supposed to complete the book of Psalms. What's the workaround for not doing the whole thing? You complete the book of Psalms by starting towards the end, right? So that's actually why we start, if you're moving from 140 to 150, 145 to 150, you're completing the book, right? And it's why if you do a shortened version, right, because we're always making choices based on time, right? What are we going to do? If you do a shortened version of the liturgy, you're always going to include Psalm 150. Right? Why 150 instead of 149? Because by doing 150, you've completed the book. So it has a particular sense of as if you read the whole book by only reading 150. Other psalms, by the way, are associated with different kinds of illnesses, different times spiritually. So people do turn to the corpus of many of these different psalms at different points. You're certainly right that the rabbis picked and chose what they associated with different times and which ones they emphasized the most. Yeah.
So just to go back to my question, when you said that Job was written as a more personal story, right? So could it have been like at that time somebody has goes through? I mean, would the writer just gone through a personal tragedy and wants to explain it, and sort of like you're sending off your article to?
It could be.
To somebody.
It could be, right? We don't, right? We can't know 100%. It could be that the author of Job is somebody who experienced in their life or looked around them and saw. It just doesn't seem true to me. Right, that when people suffer, the only explanation is they've done something wrong. It's certainly part of a larger genre of thinking that they might have been part of. It could have been a personal experience. It could have been a larger political reality. We can guess, but there's not a definitive answer to that. Martin was trying to get there, and then Steve, go ahead, Martin.
I just want to know what language were these written in? The earliest.
So we're looking at Hebrew still. We're going to see actually Aramaic in the latest books. So we'll see Aramaic seep into Daniel, right? And we'll see Aramaic in Ezra. Thank you. In Ezra Nehemiah, right? So, but we're still looking at Hebrew, and yet, as to the question of dating, one can tell by what kinds of phrases are used and how they're used, by grammatical constructions and vocabulary choices, what kind of Hebrew is being used. So that is still part of the dating process. Steve?
But just as a thought to Deborah's question, it seems to be that in the 6th century BCE, that's the time of the destruction of Jerusalem.
Correct.
The Babylonians.
Correct.
In 586.
Correct.
And so if you looked at it, that being Jerusalem was never supposed to be destroyed. It had survived the earlier attack, and so you might be looking for an explanation.
You could, and that's possible. I think the thing that makes that a hard explanation to put onto this is that actually the dominant understanding by the Jewish community was that the temple was destroyed because of our sins. And that was precisely, right, the book of Eicha minimally is making that argument. So you could say, maybe, I guess it could be a theory I haven't heard, is it possible that Job is offering a different theological explanation of that destruction as opposed to Eicha, which is making it very clear that the destruction came about because we did the wrong thing? Could be. I think it's not the dominant thought. So I think, this is just me speaking, I think it's more likely to have been related to a larger philosophical movement and or the personal proclivities of the author or authors. That's my guess. Margaret.
Are there lots of texts from this time period that could have been included but weren't included, or are these the texts that are sort of left from these time periods?
Excellent question. We actually have a record of the canonization process to some extent, and of books that were included and books that weren't. One of the things that's really neat about some of these books, some of the ones we'll look at in a minute, is actually there was significant debate in the Talmud about what was going to get in and what wasn't. And some of the things that got in were very controversial, and there was a lot of debate about them, and some of the ones that didn't get in weren't. So there were more texts at the time of canonization than we have in the Tanakh. Some of those made it in and some of those didn't. So for example, if we look at the Megillot, it's a perfect transition here. You're looking at the Megillot all over the place in terms of when they were written and what they're about, because again, what is this really following? What's the connection between them? The connection between them is the calendar. These are the ones we read at different holidays. They're not connected by genre or by style or by time. So for example, Song of Songs, right? Song of Songs, and it says here, written in the 10th century BC, and I gotta tell you, that it's dated by different scholars in different ways. Some would say that I borrowed this piece. Some of the scholarship I've read actually says closer to 4th to 6th century. There's a wide debate about when it was written. What we do know is that it was hotly debated. There were rabbis who thought that this should not make it into the Tanakh. Now, why would this have been hotly debated? Song of Songs, which we read on Pesach because it talks about springtime, so that's kind of the thematic connection, is basically a series of love poems. They are racy love poems. They are really explicit and really, really erotic love poems. Some of those love poems are describing the female body from a male author. Some of those are describing from a female narrator describing a male body. They describe in detail people coming together in romantic union and the tension between them. What Song of Songs doesn't do, and it shares this characteristic with Esther, is it's one of the 2 books in the Torah, in the Tanakh, that does not mention God. There are some hints. Some people will say that Shir HaShirim has one hint towards God towards the end in one statement where there's a yah tacked on at the end of a word. So maybe, kind of, but on the whole, it's actually not a book about God, right? Or at least at the pshat level of it. So you can imagine that there were rabbis at the time of canonization who said, you want to put what in there? A series of racy poems that aren't about God or Torah? How is that getting in? And we actually have a story that I think it was Rebbe Akiva. Yep, it was Rebbe Akiva who actually argues that this is the holiest of all books and that we have to get it in there. Now, what's that about? That is about that this was read throughout history as an allegory. It's been understood as an allegory of love between God and the Jewish people. So rather than many of the different parts of the Tanakh which give a sense of the Father God or the God as King, this is God as lover, right? It's actually a God in relationship with. And that is how the tradition dominantly has understood this, as an allegory about a loving relationship with one pining for God and God pining for us in Shir HaShirim. So it's a very interesting piece. I taught it once with teenagers, and I asked them beforehand, what did they think the Tanakh would be rated if we were to put it in a movie theater and they all said, PG-13, right? And then we read Shir HaShirim and the ratings moved significantly. Whether it's an R or an X I think depends on whether you're digging into the Hebrew a little more intensely, but it's not subtle, let me say. So that's Song of Songs. We read it on Pesach. I actually grew up reading this as part of my Haggadah in my family. It's right. That's a not such a common practice, but it was reclaimed by the kibbutz movement in Israel. That when people were coming back to the land of Israel and saying we don't want to just sit in our study houses, but actually work the land, this was a text that really spoke to those secular pioneers. It's not so much about God, but it is about land and springtime and getting our hands dirty. And so that sort of came into the kibbutz movement's sense of what Pesach would sound like. And I inherited that through my family, for whom that's the tradition from which I come. So that's Song of Songs.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there a number of them? Like there were.
Yeah. How many chapters? I believe it is 9 chapters. I believe that's correct. And the poems, some of them a whole chapter hold a poem, and some of them there's pieces of them. Ruth is a nice short book, 4 chapters. Ruth is the book that we read on Shavuot. We read it on Shavuot because it tells a story of somebody attaching herself to the Torah. What's interesting about Ruth, let me see if I agree with their dating. Oh, I totally disagree with the dating in this chart. Sorry. There it is. But we can see the disagreement between me and the author here. Ruth, I believe, from other scholars I've read, particularly from Tikva Freimer-Kensky, who wrote about this extensively, and Tamara Cohen, you can date more to the 6th or 5th centuries BCE, a much later text. Ruth is about a Moabite woman who ultimately becomes part of the Jewish people. And the thing that's interesting in the book is that she's consistently referred to, in fact, as Moabite. It never stops saying Ruth the Moabite. So whether or not she converts, which is the typical Jewish understanding that she becomes Jewish by converting, the text wants to remind you of where she comes from. Why is that interesting? Because the Torah tells us that you can't marry a Moabite pretty explicitly. And yet Ruth the Moabite becomes the ancestress of King David, right? So something's happening here in the text. Freimer-Kensky argues that actually, if you believe that Ruth and Ezra were written around the same time, which she does, that we actually see 2 different polemics talking about intermarriage written at the same time with 2 different ideas. Because when we were returning from exile in Babylonia, people brought with them their spouses who were not Jewish at that time. Ezra tells people to divorce their non-Jewish spouses. Ruth is telling a story about actually that somebody who wasn't born in the Jewish community could become part of our people. So that's Freimer-Kensky's understanding of actually kind of a political polemic that's underlying the beautiful story of chesed and kindness and coming into the Jewish people. So it's an interesting text. It's our core Shavuot text. Lamentations, Eicha, right, is what we read on Tisha B'Av. Eicha is ascribed by the tradition to the prophet Jeremiah. Again, you're going to hear lots of pieces about authorship that we may or not uphold with scholars, but it's what we believe to be true Jewishly. It's ascribed to Jeremiah. There's reasons for that. In Chronicles, there's actually some references there that sort of make sense out of it. And the timing isn't bad because it's clearly describing the end, the destruction of the temple. So the question is, did the authors who wrote it directly witness that, or were they recalling historical memories of that at a later time? Most people believe they probably lived, the author or authors probably lived pretty close to the time. The details are vivid and they add up, they make sense in terms of the history, as opposed to something that was told at a much later time. So probably we're looking at a series of poems that are written after the destruction of the temple and are talking about that moment. Kohelet is Ecclesiastes. Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, again, we said, is one of the pieces that is ascribed traditionally to King Solomon, to Shlomo. We believe he wrote it in his middle years. We read it on Sukkot. Why do we read Kohelet on Sukkot? So that piece comes. So that's good. I like that. It's a more cogent explanation than a lot of people have, Irene. What most scholars come to is that we actually have no idea. Nothing really adds up too well. It seems not unlikely that there was a point when the other 4 scrolls were easily associated with different holidays, and we wanted to figure out a time to read Kohelet. And so they thought Sukkot was the holiday that was missing a Megillah. So in truth, that's actually what probably happened. It's not an exciting explanation, but it's probably the accurate one. Right, so Kohelet ends up being read on Sukkot. Again, you're going back to that generic wisdom literature. You're talking not about the idea of sacrifice and temple, but really the idea of wisdom and really daily pleasure. What Kohelet is written by someone in the palace, that's very clear, and somebody in a palace in Jerusalem, somebody coming from a wealthy place, and he's talking about how life is really futile and everything adds up to nothing, and your only way through is to enjoy daily pleasures as they arise. So very carpe diem. Right? That's kind of what's happening here with the author of Kohelet. It's one of the pieces that we can actually date pretty tightly here. They put here 450 to 200. It's actually 450 to 180. It's very precise because it includes, somebody asked about language, it includes Persian actually in it, so that gives us a really good historical clue to what's going on here. And it includes some Aramaisms, meaning not Aramaic per se, but Aramaic influence on the text. But we also see it cited by a later text called Ben Sira. So it had to come before Ben Sira. So it's somewhere in 450 to 180. Lots of these pieces are guesses about the text. That's not a guess. That's on. That's when this text was written. It was somewhere in that time period. Because of those pieces, we can tell that. The final book in the Megillot is Esther, right? Esther we read on Purim. Why? Because it talks about Purim. So there are some theories, Adele Berlin in particular shares this theory, that it may be that what happened first was Purim or what happened second was the book of Esther, right? It could be that there was a historical practice of this holiday and the authors worked their way backwards into the explanation thereof. It's hard to know. One way or the other, we have this very intense drama that's also told not dissimilar from Joseph and Daniel. Those 3 stories can be read together. Joseph, Daniel, and Esther are all Jews who live in a non-Jewish palace, right? And they go through their palace drama. So they all seem to have a certain resonance in terms of their narrative quality with each other about what it means to survive and thrive in the diaspora, right? It's a diasporic text by nature. And we think it was probably written to be a comedy, so we shouldn't read it too seriously. It's probably a text that was intended to be read as comedy and satire, and it's meant to make us laugh along the way. And again, it actually justifies the practice of Purim itself. Yes, sir.
I'm confused about the attribution of Ecclesiastes to Solomon.
Yeah.
Solomon?
Yeah.
Because the date doesn't fit
Well,
so hard.
Great, well, that's because the rabbis have different ideas than historical scholars, so it depends who you want to go with. So according to the rabbis, it was written by King Solomon, which would have meant it was written a long time ago, right? A long time before what most historical scholars think. The problem is that historical scholars don't always agree with these attributions of the rabbis, because it may be that in ancient times, people attributed this status to a book because it gave it a good status. If it was written by King Solomon, you would really want to pay attention to it. If it was written by some guy, much later, then that doesn't sound as good, right? So it's a debate. According to traditional scholars, if you were in a frum community, right, we're approaching these texts from the standpoint of history. If you were approaching these texts from the standpoint of Midrash, Talmud, the Jewish thought, you would say it was written by Solomon, which would mean it was written much earlier. Right? Most scholars believe it was actually written much later. At the end of the day, it doesn't really change what the text is and how it lives for us necessarily, but there's a debate there. Yeah. The Jewish tradition would also tell us that every psalm was written by King David. Most scholars would disagree with that statement. That's okay. Yeah. Charles.
So under the theory where the Purim holiday preceded writing the book of Esther,
Yeah.
So is it that the story was already around, which is an oral story, to account for it to be written down, or are you saying that the elements of the Purim ritual that don't have to be story had already become a holiday, and then the story came to justify.
So both theories exist. Both of those theories exist. The final chapter of Esther reads as a little bit choppy if you go back to it. It doesn't flow as well as the rest of the narrative. There's a beautiful narrative arc throughout where you can kind of follow the flow. There's parallelisms. It builds on each other. There's drama. And the last piece, you suddenly read this stuff that says, and these are the practices of Purim, and you're supposed to do them in this way, and by the way, this was on this date, oh no, it was on that date, and it kind of runs in a way that it sounds almost like a different hand, right? So there are some people who think that perhaps first was this practice, and later the narrative developed. Other people developed that probably there was a practice and some sense of the story around it, and perhaps the story was brought out further. The rabbis actually acknowledge it as being redacted. They talk about it. They say that they had some kind of earlier text by a guy named Mordechai, and then they took the ideas of that and wrote it into what became Esther. So even the rabbis kind of acknowledge there are more hands in that pot along the way.
I understand that Esther is the only book that doesn't appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I was wondering if it was written that earlier, the Dead Sea Scrolls are later, how does scholarly account for the absence of it in the only existing manuscripts that exist from the...
What accounts for the lack of Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
If it was written as early as said. Because I've heard a theory that Esther was written much later than the 5th century BCE because of the absence of any reference in it within the Dead Sea Scrolls. Are there any earlier writings that refer to it?
I've seen it dated 4th century. I've seen it dated 5th century, but those tend to be the dates that I see. And why would it not be in the Dead Sea Scrolls
at all? And that's the only book, as I understand it, that has no remnants in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I don't know. It's a great question. I promise not to make up answers when I don't know. I'm sorry if that's less fun, but I don't know. I'm happy, again, I'll add that to my list of things to look up and get back to you. Not sure. There's one more set of books. There's one more set of books that make up the corpus of Ketuvim. And these are them. Daniel. We talked a little bit about Daniel, how Daniel's one of those palace narratives, right, along with Esther and Joseph, right? So Daniel is one of the Jews who is exiled in Babylonia and later in Persia. It's actually 2 books. We mostly think probably 2 authors. One is a series of stories, and one is a series of kind of wackadoodle visions. They're really very intense visions that Daniel has. The basic message of the book is that God saved Daniel in the exile and would save us as all. We get into some eschatology at the end, some visions of the end days. It's, again, one of the books that we can actually date pretty tightly for some reasons, and that's because when he talks in his visions, he describes the defilement of the temple. Think about this, the defilement of the temple and the altar in particular. What holidays that remind you of? Hanukkah, that's correct. So because he's referring clearly to Antiochus Epiphanes and his rule, we can actually date when this probably happened. So we're talking about the range being 167 to 163. Why? Because he had to have witnessed what happened under Antiochus Epiphanes, but he didn't see the end. Because what's interesting is Daniel predicts a different ending than history actually saw. Daniel foretells a history of how that story would end that just didn't happen. So therefore we think that probably he had to have written this on the one hand after the temple had been defiled, and on the other hand before history played out the way that we know it did around 163. So it's a text that, I don't know if you're interested in dating of texts, but I am. I think it's super interesting. And this is one of the texts that we can actually get a pretty clear historical read on where it's coming from. And it's got Aramaic. So again, it's one of the only 2 texts that we have that has that straight up, not Aramaisms, but Aramaic. This along with Ezra and Nehemiah, right, has Aramaic in it. So it's a pretty interesting story. And again, we've got the narrative, and then we've got these grand visions of the end of days, right, that are kind of part of the Daniel story. Daniel lives a much bigger life in the Christian tradition than it does in the Jewish tradition. In truth, right, to Irene's question, right, when do you see these texts? We don't really see Daniel, right? It's not something, maybe we heard of Daniel in the lion's den, right, maybe, right, to all those stories, but on the whole, it's not a text that has a big place Jewishly, and at the same time, it's an interesting story that's out there. It's also got to be, Gary, what do you think, hardest text to read in the Tanakh? Yeah? Yeah.
Hard because.
The language. The language issues are really hard. Yeah.
So why did it become a big story in the Christian?
I think there's a lot, first of all, the eschatology that's in there about talking about the end days and the coming redemption has a much larger place in the life of Christianity than it does in the life of Judaism, which isn't to say that we don't have that stuff. It's there, but it doesn't live as much in its emphasis in our tradition as it does in the Christian tradition. So that's probably a big piece of it.
Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha, and
Yeah.
not, and that is part of our tradition. Why did Daniel make it in and not Maccabees?
A great question, because we seem to be talking about things that are happening around the same time, and we know that Maccabees we see in the Talmud, we know that we see it in the Apocrypha, what becomes the Christian Bible, right? The stories of Hanukkah are not in the Tanakh, right? So how did Daniel get in and Maccabees didn't? I haven't seen that debate in the Talmud. When they seem to be debating it, they're not talking about Maccabees at the time, so I'm not sure. Great question. And can I have a pen for questions that I want to look up?
I only have like a marker.
Let me have a pen.
That's it.
The people have great questions that deserve answering. Why? Great question. Oh, great. Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah are really two, we sometimes refer to them separately and sometimes as one book. In the Christian Bible, they're more separated. In the Jewish Tanakh, they're more understood as parts of the same story, two different parts of the same story. Ezra and Nehemiah are writing after the exile when the Jews are returning to the land. So it's a very particular setting, and we hear about three different leaders in succession: Zerubbabel, then Ezra, then Nehemiah, at three different eras of immigration. So it's not just that the Jews all come back at once, there's waves. And these different waves of people coming back are figuring out what it means to reintegrate into the land after a time living apart. And in case we thought that they came back exactly as they left, they didn't. The text makes it clear. They were influenced by the place they lived and the resources that they had at the time. So there's lots of debates about who's Jewish and who's not Jewish. Again, referring back to the Ruth, right, story, that there's Ezra is very clearly encouraging people to leave their spouses from exile in exile and to create new lives only with people who he understands as part of the Jewish community. So there's a peoplehood question that is here, and there's also a question of how to live a life of Torah. So if we get to it, we may see a text that actually Ezra is the first person who institutes public Torah reading. So the fact that we read Torah publicly was Ezra's idea. And we actually see this in the book of Nehemiah, where the Torah is read aloud to the people. It's translated. He makes sure there's translators around because they don't understand Hebrew. So they translate it in time, in real time. And at the end, they cry because they realize that they're not doing what they were supposed to be doing all this time, that they lost track of the tradition. And then they celebrate Sukkot. So we get a sense that probably some of those texts from Devarim in particular, and Leviticus also, were lost about Sukkot. They had no idea of Sukkot, and they're shocked to hear that there's this huge holiday that they haven't been honoring, and so they want to do it. So Ezra also carries that particular resonance. I think it's a very powerful figure for us to reflect on as somebody who understands that we've lost access to our roots and to our education, and he's trying to institute a practice of bringing it back to the people and giving us the information that we've been lacking.
I sense from the living, I'm not. It's these writings contradict roots somewhat.
Yeah.
And so is it writings that plan more in determining who's a Jew?
That's a really good question. The truth is that the Jewish legal tradition, either in antiquity or today, depends very little on any of these texts because they're stories, right? And so the chief rabbinate in current days nor the ancient laws are very rarely going to cite from these texts. And in fact, in the Talmud, if you did cite from these texts, it would be considered a very weak proof text. Very strong proof texts come from the Torah itself, but the later writings, Ketuvim, are not seen as being as persuasive. So we do see throughout the Talmud, for example, people will cite from Mishle, from Proverbs, not irregularly, because it kind of has a little bit of everything. It's daily advice that's saying, like, be nice to your friends and listen to your parents and, wash behind your ears. Right? It's like that kind of a text. And so it's pretty easy to quote from that and support whatever argument you want to make is the truth. So the rabbis aren't always so compelled. Like if somebody says, oh, but you can see that in a Mishle, you can kind of see them rolling their eyes and saying, yeah, okay, what else do you have? Right? So even though these texts are really beautiful stories, and I think it's so interesting the way that Freimer Kensky in particular positions Ezra and Ruth as being a debate that was a hot debate in time, and we got both pieces of it, which I think is such a marvelous piece of understanding even the Tanakh as actually honoring different voices in the same period. They're not the texts that people are going to cite so much. They're going to come back to the Torah text itself and the way that that talks or doesn't talk about these issues. Yeah. Ezra and Nehemiah. Yeah.
So why wouldn't they want to? What would be the reason?
For Ezra historically, well, he was afraid. Right? He was afraid of the influence of a different culture. Right? They've been living.
No, but why wouldn't they want it have to be in the common story?
It's not that it's not per se demoted from prominence. It's just not taken to be legally convincing. Right? They're interesting texts, and they're texts that we might learn about, but we can see that they're not texts that we read day to day because they're not in the Torah, right? And they're not texts that carry a lot of legal weight. The legal weight is really going to be found in the Torah and then in the interpretive tradition that follows the Torah and the Mishnah and the Gemara. And these texts, while they live an important place in Jewish history, Jewish thought, Jewish narrative, Jewish identity, less so in Jewish legal process. So it's just a different thing.
It's been part of the debate. What do we want to include?
What I don't recall a debate about Ezra and Nehemiah and whether to include it. It could be that that's there as well. I've seen definitely some of the hot debates about the different Megillot and whether to include them, for sure, especially because of the absence of God. Ezra and Nehemiah, I think, was generally taken to be a good thing to include. The last book that we're going to talk about is Divrei Hayamim, is Chronicles. Chronicles is a retelling of stories we already heard in the Tanakh. It retells the stories that we hear in the books of Samuel and Kings, particularly of the kingship of David, Solomon, and the Judean kings that follow it. So it's telling actually the same stories, but it's written by a different author at a much later time, and it's got a different agenda. Right? So this is kind of interesting because you know this to be true, that two people could tell the same story, but they would tell it totally differently. Right? So you can actually compare side by side the way that the books of Samuel and Kings tell these stories and the way that Chronicles tell the stories, and you can see that Chronicles at a later date has a different agenda. Some of the agenda is that those books of Samuel and Kings, when they're telling the story of King David, they don't really talk about the Torah per se. They talk about doing the right thing in God's eyes, but they don't talk about the Torah. The chronicler, the author here, wants to put the word Torah in there kind of all over the place. So that's there. But the biggest thing that we see that's the difference between the perspective of the chronicler and the perspective of Samuel and Kings is that the chronicler makes David look really good and Solomon look really good. So all that dicey stuff about King David, where he seems to make a lot of mistakes and does things that God doesn't like and does things that the people don't like and does things that, for example, make it that Solomon will build the temple and not him because he has too much blood on his hands, like wash over that. That's not what we need to know right now. We're going to tell a story about the great kings of the past, how grand they were, how they blessed us, and how we love to celebrate that history as we see it moving into the future. So there's an idealized version of those rules as opposed to the version that we hear in the earlier books, which again, I think one of the most fascinating things about this process of canonization is, isn't it interesting that the rabbis weren't afraid of a multivocal approach to the Tanakh itself? That wasn't fearful to them, it was fine. You could have Ruth and you could have Ezra. You could have Chronicles and you could have Samuel and Kings. You could have Job and you could have Deuteronomy. You could have inside the Torah itself 2 different stories of creation. The idea of having multiple ways of looking at the same idea or the same thought is actually part of the Tanakh. It's not just a part of the rabbinic tradition that follows. It's right there in the Torah. Before we move on to some study and to getting into some of these texts, does anyone have any questions? Any other questions that I might be able to answer or not? Okay, good. So then, so then we're going to pass out some sheets and learn a little bit. How long? Who asked the question earlier about Uts? Where is Uts? The answer seems to be modern day Jordan. I'm working here. We're gonna get there. Okay. Great. So I know that you've studied in pairs before, so what we're going to do is take some time to learn from the texts of Ketuvim. What I've done is I've given you a sample of each of the 3 genres that we talked about. So you have a sample first of, I believe, Psalm 81. Is that correct? Yep, Psalm 81. That's because that's the Psalm for Thursday. So it's Thursday. So if you want to look at the Psalm for Thursday, that's the first text that we have that I thought we could talk a little bit about what's happening in the poetry, what's happening in the text, what is the text saying about God. You might ask yourself, why do you think the rabbis chose this psalm? You could ask the really hard question of why do you think they chose it for Thursday, which best of luck to you if you come up with a good theory. You could also ask the question of all the 150 psalms, why was this elevated to be one of the 7? Right? You know, what's happening here in the poetry that the rabbis thought, this should be in one of our daily psalms. This is a good one. So that's Psalm 81. I'm sorry, Brandon, I promised to give you a copy of that. The second text that we have is Nehemiah chapter 8. I hinted at this piece. I didn't hint. I talked about this piece. Nehemiah chapter 8 is the piece that talks about the first public Torah reading that we were talking about. That moment when Ezra brings the translators in and we hear the Torah read and we hear Sukkot come to life. So I think it might be a really interesting historical piece for you to explore. And the final piece I brought is Song of Songs chapter 8. It's pretty racy, so make sure that we're all adults in the room. Song of Songs chapter 8 has, I think, some of the most beautiful and oft-cited love poetry that comes from Shir Hashirim. So you'll see in here, again, that notion of a literature which is celebrating love, and what would be useful, I think, is to read through it in 3 ways. To read through it as if you were reading the love of 2 individuals, right, of the pshat level, the literal level, to read through it as, and then read through each character in different fashion, as if you're hearing about God as the man and Israel as the woman, God as the woman and Israel as the man, and see what is that doing when you read that theologically in that way. Those are 3 great options. I suggest that in your chavruta you pick one, right? You pick one text to start with and read through it and talk about it with your partner. And I want to pause at the end so that we can come back together and hopefully share. And I imagine that different people have chosen different texts to study, which is just fine. So if you get to all three, that's fantastic, but I don't expect that we will, because I want to reserve some time for discussion at the end. Any questions before you start studying? No? Okay, so let's study. Join in some conversation. Okay, great. Thank you for engaging in conversation. I hope these were some interesting, meaty texts to spend some time with. I wanted to just take a moment to talk together about what you learned and what you garnered from it. So let's start with the psalm. For those who read the psalm, what jumped out at you or surprised you, or what did you take away from that text? Psalm for Thursday. Charles.
Well, one thing that jumped out at me was just trying to stress the continuity going from the God of Jacob to the God of Exodus to the God today. And we actually were struggling with the last line. The Hebrew seemed to be in the present tense versus I say to you with names in the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Because those translated English in the past.
Yeah, so the translations on the whole are translations that are trying to smooth out what often isn't smooth in the text.
Yeah, so I was thinking make more sense in the present tense.
Sure. Right, so you're seeing in there the continuity, right, that the psalmist, the poet, is emphasizing a God of history who's moved throughout history and into our own lives today, right? And you're seeing that in the text. Beautiful. Yeah, Steve.
We have a explanation for Thursday.
Okay, let's hear it. Okay.
Here it is. The week starts out with a high. First psalm is creation.
Okay.
It says creation. By the time of Wednesday, we're immersed in our normal secular lives, and it's a bummer. So the psalm for Wednesday is really the worst one in terms of things are really bad and they're very bad.
It is the worst. It's the longest. Yeah, that's really long. Yeah. Right there on Hump Day, you get the longest one. Yeah.
And also the neatest one is slow.
Yes.
And now it's the middle of the week. So we're starting to come towards Shabbat. So what do we have in Thursday? We have music, we have hope if you do things right, so that there's a trajectory from the heights where we've had Shabbat to the depths of Wednesday, and now we're starting to rise.
It's beautiful. So what Steve has done is a beautiful drush, which is a great transition actually, right? Because as you leave studying Tanakh, right, as you leave studying the corpus of the Hebrew Bible, the next thing will be to move into the rabbinic traditions of how we interpret those texts and give extra meaning to them. So that sounds very rabbinic drush, very beautiful. It could be. We don't know. They didn't give us notes, so let's go with it. Yeah.
It's trash.
It was.
Church
Drush. Okay. So how about for anybody who took on the text from Nehemiah? What jumped out to you? John?
Well, I mean, I love that it rediscovers Sukkot. It even talks about Shemini and Sarah, it talks
Right.
about the Lulav.
Right.
And I mean, the fact that people were doing it. And the other thing is, there's so many things in the early part that we do now, reading Torah publicly,
Yep.
rejoicing around Torah.
Yep.
We have the owning act, so we're only doing it in the morning, we don't read Torah.
Right.
There's so many cool things here that I'm just impressed to go back to this stuff. And so, I mean, it's almost like, a complaint.
Well, and I think it's so neat to go back to that text in particular because so much of what we do in our practice is based on this, at least as our understanding that this was the first moment. And again, because it's a later text, it's starting to look more like our lives, right? So you do see that there. Yeah, Marla.
We like the inclusivity of it, that the Torah was read aloud to everyone, all men, women, anyone who could listen and understand it. So.
Beautiful, right? It is a really inclusive vision that Ezra gathers the entire community, that says men, women, and all who could understand, right? So he's really bringing the group together. Rhonda.
The leaders of the tribes studied the next day.
That's true. That's true, right? So on the one hand, there is an understanding here of a scholarly elite, right? Probably the folks who were able to do the translation, right? For example, right? And the larger public who doesn't have access to that knowledge and is going to go off and live their daily lives and work. So you do start to see that, and certainly that's something we see throughout the rabbinic era over and over and over is a question of who has access to that knowledge and how are they disseminating it or not to the masses. Yeah. Elizabeth.
What really resonated was how just unabashedly joyous this is. And yes, the part about celebrating Sukkot, but even in the beginning that it's the people who ask for the Torah. And it's not the usual story of the prophet haranguing the people about their sins. And they want to receive this. And you don't see that a lot with Israel.
Right, I love that. That's you're right, and what a beautiful moment to see actually the hunger of a people coming back from exile who are just craving, right, their tradition that they have been robbed of, and they're looking to get back to it, and they come to that not with bitterness and anger, but with joyful abandon. Yeah, beautiful.
I just had a question because we didn't understand how the Torah was kept in exile. Like
What were they doing?
Like
they were.
Like who kept that so that when it came back, somebody was able to disseminate it again?
Well, right. So not every. So there are two possibilities, and I don't know the one that's in this text in particular. I have to look closer. There is certainly some sense that people may have taken things with them into exile, but have lost the ability to know what to do with it or how to understand it. So that could be. And there's also a sense that we don't think that everyone went, but many people went. So it could be that there were some who were remaining back home who had access to the documents but didn't have sovereignty or leadership at the time, right? When the people are brought back from exile, right, that's under Cyrus, right? So when Cyrus becomes king, when the Persian Empire takes over from the Babylonians, Cyrus is one of his first acts to allow people access to return to their homelands. So it could be that and that's not only access to return, but access to some level of sovereignty, right? Not complete, but some level of self-governance and religious sovereignty. So it could be that there were people who actually had held on to that. Rhonda.
I like the overall message of that. Don't cry over spilled milk. Don't get stuck on the past and what you missed. Go forward and rejoice and celebrate and embrace this.
Right. So they cry, right, and he tells them actually to stop, right, and to move forward. So that part resonated for you. That there's a sense of it's okay. What happened. Let's move on. Okay. How about the Song of Songs piece? Okay.
So you suggested we read this as God as well as
Right.
man and a woman,
Right.
and a woman and a man, and in doing that, it's so personified. You can start to extrapolate certain things and see certain things, but it is so profoundly personified that it's such a different idea of God than I have experienced so many other places in Judaism.
For sure.
Which is just God is so abstract everywhere.
Right. So not only sort of moving from kind of what we talked about, the vertical relationship with God to a horizontal relationship with God, which is proposed by the allegorical read, but even just the sense of God as personified is so not what we do, right, in other kinds of Jewish thinking. Yeah, really, really different to get into that. Yeah.
It wasn't one narrative. It seems to have bounced.
Correct. So probably around verse 7, right, you'd see the first narrative end, and verse 8, you begin to see a dialogue that moves a little bit back and forth, where 8 and 9 is one person and then 10 is the response, right? So you see probably at least 2 different streams in there. So the chapters don't break down necessarily in Song of Songs by a full poem, and maybe there are 2 or 3 poems that are incorporated within what is in a chapter, right? So that's absolutely true. Yeah.
So, I think it was last week we learned that the Calvary and Torah is something that was a Christian thing. Is that the same here as the numbering, not the Jewish? Now, it wasn't done by the Jewish writers, but more Christian thing to help make it easier to follow.
In terms of the chapters or the verses? The chapters and the verses do follow a Jewish breakdown of them, and there are even different chapters and paginations sometimes than we see in the Christian Bible. There are some differences in certain books about where we break things and where Christians break things in terms of sentence, not in terms of sentences, but in terms of the verse numbers and such. And so while those are Jewish, they're certainly not in the original text. The verse numbers aren't numbered per se, right? So that comes from a later period of time of adding that on to these.
The same.
The chapter breaks you can usually see in scrolls. So the way that a scroll is written will show you a chapter break. So that probably comes from earlier. So it may be that there was an earlier time when a series of poems were chosen to put together into a singular chapter. Anybody else about Song of Songs? No? Okay, great. It's been a pleasure. Oh,
I
Margaret?
was gonna ask, what is if she be a wall? Do you know why a woman would be compared to
Yeah.
if she be a wall 9?
Right, so I think what's happening in 8 and 9 is you're probably hearing the voices of males attempting to protect the female in this context, who's taken to be sexually vulnerable. Right, so what do? If she is a wall, we will build a battlement around her. If she's a door, we will panel it like cedar. So you're hearing what the older brothers or uncles or someone like that saying there's this sexually vulnerable young girl and we want to protect her from being from being taken by a man. So that's probably, I think, what's happening there. Okay, and on that note, thank you for the learning tonight. Have a good Thursday.